The Scrutiny by Richard Lovelace. Why should you swear that I am forsworn, since thine I vowed to be? Lady, it is almost morn, and 'twas last night I swore at fond impossibility. Have I not loved thee much and long, a tedious 12 hours space? I must all other beauties wrong, and rob thee of a new embrace, could I still dote upon thy face. Not but all joy in thy brown hair by others may be found, but I must search the blank and fair like skilful mineralists that sound for treasure in unploughed up ground. Then, if I have loved my round, thou provest the pleasant she, with spoils of meaner beauty crowned, I laden will return to thee, ever sated with variety. What I'd like to talk to you about today is the importance of context and a little bit about what we mean at A-level when we talk about the context of a text and the ways in which it can help us to access different meanings or take on different perspectives in a text as well. And as an example this morning, I'm going to use Richard Lovelace's poem, The Scrutiny from 1642. It's time to dip into the pre-1900s. So when we talk about context at GCSE, we largely mean historical context, what's happening politically, socially, in government, at the time in which a text is written. And then we think about the ways in which that influences some of the meanings, and the concerns is quite a good word to use there, of a text itself. But we're doing the same thing at A-level, but we're expanding our definition of the word context. So what I'd like to suggest to you is we start to think about context in 3 different categories. And this isn't limited to the poetry, but it's the poetry I'm going to talk about this morning. We stick then with historical context. What's the landscape like to be a citizen in the time in which a text is written? But then we might also think about the literary tradition of a text. What type of writing is it? In the poetry, is it a ballad? Is it a dramatic monologue? Is it a sonnet? And what's happening within that tradition? Does it change from the sonnets, for example, of the 1500s to the sonnets of the 2000s? And what are authors doing within the structures and within those frameworks of that type of writing that are different depending on the time that they're written? The last context to look at is authorial context. And we want to consider what are the personal experiences of the author, who is, let's remember, the architect of this text, and how does that affect their concerns, their interests, and what it is that they're choosing to communicate to us. So we're going to take Lovelace's poem as an example, have a very brief potted history of the English Civil War, and see where that takes us in understanding meaning. Now, what I'm going to do is just put Lovelace's poem up so you can see it. So let's walk through it one more time, and then I'll give you a short summary of what it's about, and then we'll start to think about different contexts and see if the meanings of it change. Why should you swear that I am forsworn, since thine I vowed to be? Lady, it is already morn, and 'twas last night I swore to thee that fond impossibility. Have I not loved thee much and long, a tedious 12 hours space? I must all other beauties wrong, and rob thee of a new embrace, could I still dote upon thy face. Not but all joy in thy brown hair by others may be found, but I must search the blank and fair, like skilful mineralists that sound for treasure in unploughed up ground. Then, if when I have loved my round, thou provest the pleasant she, with spoils of meaner beauties crowned, I, laden, will return to thee, ever sated with variety. Now, hopefully on second reading and with the text presented in front of you, you'll be able to pick up just how devilish this poem is. But like all devilish things, chocolate fudge cake, the Rolling Stones, there's delight to be had in it too. Scrutiny is basically a narrator arguing that, yes, I promised that I loved you, I swore that I love you, and then we spent 12 fantastic hours together horizontally, And now the morning's here, I kind of want to go and see what else is out there. And you should too. You know, let's not limit our loving to each other when we can be like these Millerists and find new delights in others. And then if we don't find anything better, we can come back to each other. Now, that is a pretty 21st century argument for a 17th century poem, isn't it? So we can see then that we have this first person dramatic monologue to this unseen listener. Why should you swear that I'm forsworn? Which is effectively a rhetorical device and a rhetorical speech designed to get out of a relationship. Interesting. So let's have a little look at some of those notions of context and see whether that changes or whether that emphasizes any particular parts of the text for us. Now, you'll see that our poem is written in 1642. And as we all know, I didn't know, I had to look it up. This is right in the middle of the English Civil War. Now, this is an English literature lesson and not a history lesson. So I'm just going to whiz through some key points here for you. Firstly, we refer to it as the English Civil War, when actually it was a civil war of the British Isles. The fighting started in England, but very much involved Scotland and spread out to England and Wales as well. So it's not really any corner of the land that doesn't experience some sense of bloodshed. What's at the heart of the English Civil War is two factions, the Royalists and the Parliamentarians. Now, who is on the throne at this time, to start off with, it doesn't end well for him, is Charles I. So Charles I says, I'm the king, what do I need Parliament for? Parliament's existed for a long time already. I don't need Parliament, I don't want them interfering in taxes, I don't want to have to ask their permission for things, I'm going to rule without them. I'm going to put in place ship taxes and land taxes to raise money for the crown, and I don't have to ask Parliament's permission for anything. So he makes these very sweeping changes to the country, but if you don't have a parliament, you don't have anyone to complain to. There's also this huge social turbulence and social unrest because of religious differences. England is predominantly at this time a Protestant country and very suspicious of Catholicism because it's the religion of the English and of the Spanish and the French and the Italians, who are traditionally enemies to the English crown and the English people, and so very unpopular as well. Parliament, having been sent away, is then recalled when Charles I is having problems in Scotland. So he tries to put in a religious reform and tax reform in Scotland, and the Scottish say, absolutely not, we govern ourselves, we don't want to have anything to do with you. And he has to recall Parliament to get support within Scotland. So he sends them away, and then he brings them back. The 17th century is a mad, mad time. And I'm saying that in 2020. We then have two sides emerge. The Royalists, the king is chosen by God, it is divine right to rule, and some people are making very well out of it. And the Parliamentarians. And the Parliamentarians are effectively seen as the Puritans, very staunch, serious, ruling by religion in that sense as well. And then within both sides, we have these very radical factions emerge. Two phrases that might be familiar to you is the Roundheads, who are the Parliamentarians, the Puritans, and the Cavaliers, who are on the side of the king. More of them in a minute. There are three different outcomes from the Civil War. Firstly, Charles I is executed. Big deal, mega deal that Charles I is executed. We haven't executed a monarch in this country for blooming ages. His son, Charles II, is exiled, and the English monarchy for a while is suspended. We have what's established is the Commonwealth and then the Proctorate, which is effectively the British Isles under the rule of Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell. Definitely not the best Cromwell. And then his son Richard. And then they're eventually overthrown, and then the king comes back into place as well. But there we go. So the big takeaway here is the English Civil War is an incredibly turbulent time, and there are two very clear factions that emerge. Those that support the king, yes, do what you want, live your life, don't be told what to do. And those that support Parliament, actually people need to be governed, ruled, there needs to be a sense of order. So the second type of context then is when we think about the literary tradition. And Lovelace's poem falls into a rather exciting, I think, tradition of what's called Cavalier poetry. So the Cavalier poets were a school of English poets in the 17th century, and the word cavalier is about knights. It's where we get the word knight from, chevalier, which is an even more beautiful word in French. So a cavalier was traditionally a mounted soldier or a knight, but in the time of the Civil War, it became an insult. If you were a cavalier, it meant that you were a rogue, you were a gallant, you did what you wanted, you were very undisciplined, you kind of just travelled around the country doing whatever, which I think sounds like quite good fun. The Cavalier poets then sort of styled themselves on this idea of being these knights who wrote love poetry, who celebrated nature and beauty, who wanted to have a good time, were fairly hedonistic. They wanted to explore notions of pleasure and of virtues. And they were very much this kind of carpe diem, this seize the day mentality that's really prolific in their writing. And it's seen the Cavalier poetry as this expression of the opposition of puritanical ideals of being very buttoned and laced up and led by religion. There's a much more social and sensual feeling about Cavalier poetry, and we will have a look at some of it in the anthology. It's a very significant tradition for us. Finally, let's think about our poet Richard Lovelace, a wonderful description from the time from a friend of his at university, that he described Richard Lovelace as the most amiable and beautiful person that the eye ever beheld, a person also of innate modesty, virtue, and courtly deportment, which made him then, but especially after when he retired to the great city, meaning London, much admired and adored by the female sex. Now, this might be a good moment to pause the video and rewind to where I showed you the poem and to have a look a picture at Richard Lovelace and make up your own mind. So Lovelace, his poetry is influenced by a very political career. So Lovelace does a number of things within his life which are inherently political. When he is at university, he kind of sees himself as this sort of social connoisseur. He loves this idea of being a cavalier poet, and he would write poetry all the time and think this was this, again, this celebration of beauty and pleasure and so on. But he also wrote two incredibly political pieces of work, one called To Lucasta Going to the Wars and the tragedy The Soldier. And he was very interested in the notion of the turmoil of politics and of war and of religion. And so the scrutiny does kind of stand apart from a lot of his other more famous poems, where he is an incredibly political writer. Lovelace is arrested and imprisoned twice. The first in 1641, so 5 years before the poem's written, where he petitions Parliament for the abolition of episcopal rule. And then he had gone to the House of Commons to say, we're pro-loyalist and we would like to shut Parliament down. And they arrest him and they imprison him. In 1648, 3 years after the poem is written, and still an incredibly turbulent time politically, a really chaotic time, he's imprisoned again. And when he's released from prison, the king is executed. And Lovelace sees that the political campaign that he had championed is not going anywhere. I mean, later on it really does, because we do get a monarchy back again. So a very, very whizzy, you may have to go back over, pit stop through 3 different types of context for you to think about. But we have to come back to the poem. One of the things that may have happened, there he is, Richard Lovelace. One of the things that may have happened at GCSE is that you make your point and then you want to attach the context to the end of it. So you may have already written about very close language analysis and then look for the connection between the context. But if you can read the poem, think about the context and then reread it and then see what emerges, that should start to tie into that question we looked at last video, where we talked about the nature of intention. So when we look at the poem here again, that opening question, why should you swear I am forsworn, since of thine I vowed to be, becomes quite interesting to us, because it's written in the first person. It's not a rhetorical question because there does seem to be that second person listener there. Cavalier poetry is all about pleasure, but what seems to emerge here is that Richard Lovelace is writing in the first person, and he is using poetry to express something that he is clearly feeling himself as an individual. Have I not loved thee much and long, a tedious 12 hours space? Well, the Cavalier poets believe in pleasure. And this phrase now, although you may have picked up on it from how I've read it, suddenly becomes a lot more sexual. Have I not loved thee much and long? That clearly this couple have spent the night together and they're not married because they're going to check out their other options. I should have thought of some appropriate phrasing before I started the video, I suppose. They're going to check out their other options and then potentially come back to one another. So the spirit of the Cavalier poet is very much alive in the second verse. The third verse is quite interesting to us, and I've just highlighted that phrase, like skillful mineralists that sound for treasure in unploughed up ground. Now, unploughed up ground is a not so subtle allusion to virginity and women who have not yet been ploughed. But it's interesting that he takes this metaphorical term. One of the things that's very true of the Cavalier poets, and again, thinking about a much more florid, a much more metaphysical and figurative way of writing, is then the use of the metaphor here. And this idea of finding the right person to have sex with is like being a mineralist searching for the perfect jewel. And it turns something very base and very crude to sound manipulated to sound something a lot more scientific, perhaps, as well. It's interesting that it's like a logical argument and that it fits into this notion, and we'll see it later on with the post-1900 poems, that in love and relationships, there tends to be presenting with a dilemma and trying to rationalize the very irrational. Love in some cases, lust in this case. And it's interesting that we use this conditional language in the fourth stanza. Then, if when I have loved my round, I will, and thou provest the pleasant she, I will return to thee. So, where do we go next from here? You can think about the ways in which context is able to change your understanding of a poem, or perhaps more interestingly, highlight different aspects of the poem or particular phrases within the poem that you hadn't looked at before. I would never start looking at a poem with the context. I think it's really important to see the poem by itself and to get a sense of the poet or the sense of narrative voice, and then see context as a way to shift our perspective in some way. Like I said before, at GCSE, sometimes it's quite tempting to make a point about a text and then to say, and this is here because this is the contextual facts that I know. But we know from Lovelace's poem that some of the ideas that he expunges in 1642 are still relevant in 2020 as well. One of the things that you might like to do next then is to think about the Cavalier poets, see if you can find other examples, do a bit of research on the Cavalier poets, and come out of your comfort zone a little bit and look at writing from that period. The oldest poem in the anthology, I think, is the 1500s. And although there are only a couple of poems that use that very archaic language, it's a good thing to get comfortable with as well. And we can also then start to think about how other poems start to challenge those notions from that time period. It's interesting that Derek Walcott's poem, The Fist, seems to be so abstract and so modern, but the philosophy behind Lovelace's poem hasn't changed in the last however many hundred years. Okay, as always, please get in contact, ask me any questions. If you want me to have a look at any writing, some of you have already sent a few bits in. If you want any recommendations, if you want to have a name of some of the poets that we're going to look at from this period so you can have a bit of a head start, that's fine as well. Thank you very much.